This video is for section 2-3, conditional statements, and the worksheet looks like this. What we're going to do is fold it inwards towards the center. So it looks like this. And then towards the center like this. And what we're looking at is conditional statements. We'll start with the conditional statement over here. It's supposed to say conditional, and sorry in case you got one of the bad copies. And all this means is that there's two statements, if P then Q, when P and Q can be any statement on there. The hypothesis is the if statement, the if part of the statement, and the conclusion is the then part. The converse switches the order from P to Q to P. So it just switches the order of the statement. And we're going to highlight right here and the swap. For the inverse, this symbol right here means that you keep the original order, so P then Q, but you make it a not statement. So it is the opposite of the hypothesis and opposite of the conclusion. So whatever you were saying, you're just going to try to say the opposite. The contrapositive is both the inverse, which means that you put not or the opposite of each statement, and you change the order from P to Q to Q to P. So it's also the converse. So the opposite of the conclusion and the opposite of the hypotenuse, and you also have to swap it. And so if we look inside, this statement says, if you live in New Jersey, then you live in the East Coast. So what we need to write is, for the converse, it would be if you live on the East Coast, so you change the order, comma, then you live in New Jersey. So let's take a look at these statements. It says, if you live in New Jersey, then you live on the East Coast. And that would be true because New Jersey is on the East Coast. On this one, on the other hand, though, if you live in the East Coast, then you, live in New Jersey. That's not true. This would be false. Because you can live in New York, for example. That would still be the East Coast, but you're not in New Jersey. The inverse was the not statement. So this would be from the original, if you don't live in New Jersey, comma, then you don't, because it has to be the not statement of both the hypothesis and the conclusion, then you don't live on the East Coast. And so if you don't live in New Jersey, then you don't live in the East Coast. This one will also be false, because you could live anywhere else that is East Coast, not necessarily New Jersey. The contrapositive, it would be both the not and the inverse from the original statement. So it'd be if you don't live on the East Coast, comma, then you don't live in New Jersey. So this one would be true, because if you don't live in the East Coast, there's no way you live in New Jersey. Next. If a polygon is a rectangle, then it is a square. So it's telling you that it's a rectangle. It doesn't necessarily have to be a square. So this statement would be false. Let's write the converse. So that means switching the order. If a polygon, so this is just the subject of the sentence, so that would stay the same. So for example, if you, and this is a subject, if a polygon. But when you switch the order, you're switching the part that says is a square, comma, then it is a rectangle. And this one would be true, not Tuesdays. True. Because if it is a square is a type of rectangle, and that would make it correct. All right. The inverse is the not. So from the original statement, if a polygon is not a rectangle, comma, then it is not a square. So not a rectangle. If it's not even a rectangle, there's no way that it can be a square. So then it can't be a square. That makes this statement true. The contrapositive is the not of both the hypothesis and the conclusion, but switches the order. So it would be from the original, if a polygon is not a square, comma, then it is not a rectangle. So this statement would be false, because it doesn't have to be a square to be considered a rectangle. The next one. If two angles have a sum of 180 degrees, then they're supplementary. So this would be true. That's the definition of supplementary. If two angles equal 180, that is its definition, so that would be true. Let's do the converse. If two angles, so remember, like I mentioned, we're making the subject go first, so that's why it says two angles. If two angles are supplementary, comma, then they have a sum of 180 degrees. So if you call them supplementary, then they have a sum of 180 degrees. That also would be true. The converse. If two angles are not, so we would say if two angles don't have, because we're keeping it from the original order, don't have a sum of 180 degrees, comma, then they are not supplementary. So if their sum is not 180 degrees, then we cannot say that they're supplementary. So this statement will also be true. The contrapositive. So remember, it's from the original, it changes the order, and it says that they're not. So if two angles don't, I keep forgetting to change the verbiage because of what it's talking about. So remember, we had to change the order, so they are, and then to make it the inverse, they are not supplementary. Comma, then they don't have a sum of 180 degrees. So if they're not supplementary, then we can't call them, then we can't say that they have 180 degrees. So this one will also be true. Because they're all true, or the other way that we could say the statement is if two angles have a sum of 180 degrees, if and only if they are supplementary. And that's where that if and only if statement comes in. It's when they're all true. All right, the next one. It says, if two angles have a sum of 90, then both angles are acute. Okay, so let's say it this way. If, and this is the converse, so we're changing to the order. So if two angles, and that's our subject. That's why it goes the same at the beginning of the sentence. And we're changing the order. If two angles are both acute, comma, then they have a sum of 90 degrees. So let's take a look at this. If two angles have a sum of 90, then they would have to be acute. Acute means less than 90. So that would be true. If they're together, they equal 90. So this one would be true. On here, though, it says that if you have two acute, and if you have two angles that are both acute, then their sum is 90. That's not necessarily so. You could have 30 and 30, which makes 60, not 90, and that's still two acute angles. So this one would be false. And the next one says if. So this is the not of the original statement. So if two angles don't have a sum of 90 degrees, comma, then both angles are not acute. Okay, so if they don't equal 90, then they're both not acute. Well, this is false with a lot of examples. Because the sum of both of them could be one acute and one obtuse. Or you could have one obtuse and one acute. Two obtuse. There's a lot of examples that we could have. Obtuse is equal to more than 180. I mean, more than a 90. Which it is not going to equal 90 then if it's already more. Okay, and then the last statement is the contrapositive, which is the inverse and the converse. It means we change the order and make it not, where the subject is still the same. If two angles if two angles are not acute, comma, then they both don't have a sum of 90 degrees. Okay, so what I keep messing up on is the verb. So are and have, and how you make that the opposite statement. So just be careful with that. You still want to write it as correctly as possible. And this one says if two angles are not acute, so they could be obtuse, they could be 90 degrees, they could be right angles, then they both don't have a sum of 90 degrees. So yeah, that would be true. It would be impossible for them to be 90 degrees if they were already 90 or bigger than 90.